Good evening, everyone. My name is Rafael. I'd like to welcome you all to the Wheeler Centre. I'd like to thank the Wheeler Centre for inviting all of us along, including Naomi Chazan and myself. We're hoping to have a chat to her for a good 45 minutes or so, and then there'll be a chance for everybody to ask some questions and elicit whatever you think you may be able to from Naomi once we've finished having a chat. What I thought I would start with, Naomi's had a pretty illustrious career and quite an interesting career and is still obviously involved in interesting things like the New Israel Fund. But one thing I'm going to start by asking, actually, I was chatting to a very weathered and very busy and tired Member of Parliament from our federal parliament a few months ago. And she was just exhausted and tired, but I was still stunned by her real belief in the idea that it was a good idea to be a Member of Parliament, where it personally strikes me as tremendously exhausting and perhaps takes a lot more than perhaps you get. I just wonder what it was like for you being in the Knesset, being a member of the Knesset, and being in the party that you were in. If you can give people a bit of an idea what it was like and what you learnt doing that.
I wasn't expecting that question.
It just always amazes me that people go into it. So.
Can I tell you how I got into politics first? I actually, from the age of 4 to 45, only studied. Literally, that's all I did. I learned to read and write, and I went to school, and then I went to secondary school, and at the end of that, one has to go to university, so I went to university. I didn't know what to do with my life, so I went to graduate school, and I finished my master's degree, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I was having fun, so I did a PhD, and I liked that as well, and so after they offered me a lectureship, so I continued studying, and then I got a senior lectureship, and my kids I had babies that didn't sleep at night. At midnight, when they were babies, they woke up and they cried all night. So I would put them on the desk and put a pacifier, I don't know what the word is in Australia, in their mouth. A dummy in their mouth. And I would hold it with one hand, and the other hand I used a pen, and so I would write books. And so I did that, so then I became associate professor. Next thing I knew, I was a full professor, and I was perfectly happy. I was very active in a variety of feminist, peace, human rights organizations on the side. But one day, a woman called me up. Her name is Shulamit Aloni. I don't know if you know Israeli politics. She was the founder of RATZ, which is the Peace and Civil Rights Movement in Israel. And she said, Naomi, are you running? And I said, no, I'm sitting. And she said, no, are you running? This is direct translation from the Hebrew. And I said, Shula, don't you understand? I'm sitting. I was head of the Truman Research Institute at the time. I was really having fun, And she called me every single night, and we had the same conversation. And I was so obtuse, I didn't understand what she was talking about. And then I realized, I suppose the terminology here is standing for office, right? Is that correct? And one day she called me up and she said, Naomi, she said, if you do not run for the Knesset, I will go around the country and tell everybody that you're a liar. So I said, a liar? I mean, you can say lots of bad things about me, but I don't lie. And she said, yeah, because you're going around preaching for women to get involved in public life, and you're not doing it, so you've got to. And I did. It's the only decision I made in my life about what to do as a career choice. And you come along and read my mind, and I'm telling you, I'm now 7 years after the Knesset. I served 3 terms, And I'm still not sure it was a correct decision. So I'll answer your question directly now, if I may. Being in the Knesset, being in Israel's parliament, is a 24/7 job, if you take it seriously. I realized after about 2 weeks that I was at a major disadvantage in comparison to my colleagues in the Knesset, because they had all practiced yelling for a long time, and I can't yell very well. And not only that, but as fortune has it, I was seated between the two loudest basses in the Knesset, so it was hopeless. So first of all, I realized that they even they have to stop for breath. And if I catch it at the precise moment, I may be able to say a word that is audible. I also realized that being a member of Knesset means that you have to service the population, not necessarily your voters, because you haven't the foggiest idea who your voters are in Israel in a proportional representation system, but anybody who comes to you. And so I chose for 11 years to be a parliamentarian. And I was deputy speaker for half of that period, over half of that period. And I loved to make laws. I discovered that you can actually solve problems by discerning a pattern of difficulties, defining and identifying the issue, and then resolving it. And so during the course of that period, I legislated 43 bills, which is not bad, and dealing with women's rights, gender equality. I introduced consumer legislation into the country. I'm very proud of that. I did a lot on social justice issues. And as a heavy smoker, I pioneered the anti-topacco legislation in the country as well. And so in many respects, Rafi, I enjoyed that. It was fascinating. I sat on the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee for 8 years. But I'm not sure
it's just interesting that you talk about, identifying patterns and finding solutions. Because the impression, of course, that most people have of Israel and its neighbours is that Israel doesn't identify patterns and doesn't find solutions. That everybody in that region doesn't do that. I wonder, when it comes to the situation that actually stops perhaps Israel getting somewhere on all the sorts of issues that you're working on, social justice and the environment and those sorts of things. I know it's a big question in many ways, but why does the identification of patterns and the finding of solutions stop once you start chatting to or negotiating with the Palestinians and everyone else?
Once again, a superb question. And I tend to agree with the assumption that prompted the question, that for some reason on other issues we're capable of identifying challenges, understanding that an issue exists, and trying to find creative ways to resolve the issue, not for specific individuals or groups, but for society at large. Now that I'm president of the New Israel Fund, that's what we do. That is precisely what we do all the time. So why hasn't it worked for questions related to the conflict and specifically to Palestinian-Israeli relations? And by the way, I think that many Palestinians have the same problem. And my answer is because a rational approach to the conflict and to its resolution does not take account of what fuels the continuation of the conflict. And what fuels the continuation of the conflict, to a large extent, are emotional factors. And there are emotional factors of two sorts. Can I continue
Please.
for a minute? And I'm talking about the Israeli side because I know it better, but I do have many Palestinian friends, and I detect the same type of emotional problems or issues with them. The first type of emotional problem is, look, everybody my age, which is of course very young, I'm still growing, in case you didn't realize, has, in my case, my life spans the history of the country of Israel. Not one of us has been untouched by the conflict. Sometimes very personally. Lost friends, children of dear friends blown up in terrorist attacks, family members injured in wars. You know, everybody in one form or another has had to deal with that. And on the Palestinian side also, at one point during the first Intifada, 10% of the Palestinian population was incarcerated. And each one has brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, so you figure it out, okay? And the first emotional factor is all of us carry a psychological baggage which is just unbelievable. And it's very difficult to go beyond that, to make a leap and to apply your mind and your rationality to a problem because you have emotional breaks of this sort. So that's one kind. The second type of emotional factor I find much more problematic. And I admit I don't necessarily share it. But everywhere I go, I sense it, both in Israel and among Jewish communities abroad as well. And there's a tremendous amount of trepidation, or if you will, fear. It's sometimes not totally rational. Great uncertainty. We can't do this because this might happen, etc., etc. But really, fear has become overwhelming. Again, my sense is on both sides. You put it together. Nobody in any negotiating setting, and I've been in many negotiating settings, has factored in these two emotional factors or elements into the negotiations. And I think that, in a sense, to move forward, we're going to have to deal with these elusive components of peacemaking, as well as the rational ones.
Look, I do want to get you to prognosticate a bit on recent things in the region. I am going to ask you about things like the Arab Spring and those sort of things, but I also want to try and cover a little bit of sort of, I guess, internal Israeli politics. Some people here will be intimately familiar with the New Israel Front's history and the battles it's had in Israel and the odd debate it's sparked here. I don't really want to retrace that ground, but I do want to bring up...
Neither do I. I'm having too much fun.
Exactly. I want to bring up the Goldstone Report in one sense. I don't want you to address it or correct it, but I do want to talk about it in terms of the way it gets discussed and your ideas on why it becomes such a topic for discussion. If you'll forgive me, I'm just going to read something that read a few months ago in the New York Review of Books. So forgive me for not asking a question.
That's okay. That's typically Jewish.
So one of the issues clearly with the Goldstone report was whether or not there was this deliberate policy of targeting civilians and whether or not Richard Goldstone retracted that. Someone wrote in the New York Review of Books, mentioned a part of the Goldstone report that they didn't retract, and that was the fact that Operation Cast Lead in 2009 in Gaza actually began with an attack on a whole lot of policemen in Gaza who were at their induction ceremony. And the article says that some 89 were killed along with members of their family who'd come to attend the celebration. The majority were not known Hamas fighters, but simply police cadets, some of them apparently trained as traffic cops or for other minor, clearly non-combatant jobs, including 5 who were musicians in the police orchestra. I just wonder...
Is that David Shulman?
Yeah, that's David Shulman. And he goes on to talk a lot about the fact that the facts of what is reported in the Goldstone report and the way that a policy of having absolutely no harm can come to our soldiers is just as important a discussion as the people who are very angry with the Goldstone report because it says there was a deliberate targeting of civilians. Now, with that in mind, I wonder why the language of whatever policy Israel has towards civilians in an armed conflict, why does that become the thing that really pushes people's buttons in the debate about that sort of operation? And really it's a wider discussion of how Israel treats the Palestinians in a general sense.
Pushes which people's buttons? I'm trying to understand.
Well, I guess the debate, people were furious with Richard Goldstone for saying that the Israeli army was deliberately targeting civilians. Whether or not there's a policy there, I suppose David Shulman's argument is that a whole lot of people died. And the real question is to ask if hundreds of Palestinians died, including children. Isn't that the sort of question we should be asking ourselves, and not what was the exact language that was used when the Israeli army sort of decided to have some sort of policy when they went into Gaza?
I'll answer on 2 levels. If I understood the question, which I'm not quite sure I did, but nevertheless, I'll try. And one level you mentioned several times, but I want to highlight that Richard Goldstone signed a report that's known as the Goldstone Report, where the most damning thing for Israel was that Israel deliberately targeted civilians. And he retracted that in his Washington Post article. And I think it's very important because I don't think Israel deliberately targeted civilians. So that's one level. I have to confess, I was one of the few Israelis that was opposed to the operation. And I was opposed to the operation because I did not want the result that I feared would happen and eventually transpired, which would be the death of many more Palestinian civilians than Israelis. And it's the first time I found myself in a dilemma, and I'm sharing the dilemma with you, and I'll actually ask you a question, if I may. Every country, sovereign state, has the right to defend itself. And the rockets on Sderot in the Negev were creating hell in the lives of Israeli civilians. I have seen, and some of our organizations have treated traumatized kids who absolutely cannot sleep. And therefore, I could argue very strongly, and still would argue very strongly, that Israel justifiably had the right to defend itself. But where does the dilemma come in? Did it have to engage in operation to do so, and in what manner? And whether you have the right doesn't mean that you always exercise it. Especially if you're exercising that right wreaks havoc in innocent civilians on the other side, undermines your moral high ground, which is tremendously important, and exposes you to international condemnation in an extremely sensitive period. And I must admit, I'm one of those people, I don't know if you are, but I argue with myself in the shower. I even got a notice from the water company in Jerusalem that I've got too much water because I'm using too much water because I'm dealing and grappling with these issues. There's no good answer to that question. I think what responsible people can do and should do is seriously ask these types of questions, the type of question you asked, the type of question David Schulman asked, the type of questions I'm asking, and now I'll pose the question to you. What would you do?
Oh, I have no idea. That's why I ask questions and don't answer them. It's much easier. All care, no responsibility. But I also want to know why you think so many people in politics and in the media in Israel are keen to link the New Israel Fund with what they see as the worst aspects of that report. What is going on there? What's behind that? I think I saw something in Haaretz either in the last week or so that they're even trying to stop some of the organisations that the New Israel Fund supports financially getting access to people using some of their national service time in those organisations.
That's right.
Which seems to be quite that's a you know, at a philosophical level, that's a really sort of meaty attack. I just wonder what you think is driving them. What so dismays them about the Goldstone Report, and why do they want to tie
by the way, I think it has much to do with the Goldstone Report whatsoever. The Goldstone Report was a handle. It was a handle for attacking the New Israel Fund, but not really even attacking the New Israel Fund, or me personally. By the way, this poor little face had a horn on it, and billboards and bridges were with this horn for about a month last year.
And maybe you should also explain all the different groups that you do fund at some stage.
Which I will. Don't worry. I know why I'm here. And I don't get paid for it either. It's a volunteer position. But the attack was on primarily human rights and civil rights organizations. And let's be very clear about that. And the source of these attacks, and they are persistent, against human rights and civil rights organizations and civil society in general in Israel, is coming from right-wing groups who do not want to find a solution to the conflict, frankly, oppose a two-state solution, which is accepted by the majority of the people of Israel, and feel they need to find a scapegoat. And there's nothing more convenient than finding a scapegoat. I'll put it in other terms. When you're really, really afraid that you're going to have to make a decision, and that it appears that you are under attack, okay? Then you look to blame somebody. And you can't always blame all the world, because eventually it will infiltrate into your own society. And so they have targeted and focused on these organizations. And my answer, by the way, is if there weren't human rights and civil rights organizations in Israel, we would have to invent them. Because every society needs these groups, democratic society, to remind them, to remind ourselves of our values and what we're about, and to put a mirror in front of our face and say, There is no room for hypocrisy when you're dealing with human lives and you're dealing with the essential principles of justice and respect for the other and human decency. So the New Israel Fund did establish, at the time, almost every civil rights and human rights organization in Israel. We've established almost every single, jump-started almost every single social justice organization in Israel, religious pluralism, coexistence organization, women's organizations, the entire environmental movement in Israel, and most recently those organizations dealing with refugee rights in Israel. In the last 30 years, we've jump-started over 800 civil society organizations. I think it's the greatest contribution to making Israel better and to making Israel democratic. And I think the more securely democratic Israel is, the better its chances of survival. So I must admit I'm very proud of being attacked for these things, and I've never taken it very personally.
If I can use the civil rights groups and the groups that you started or helped jumpstart in Israel, a lot of what's going on in Egypt and Tunisia, I think Syria is a little bit different in some ways. A lot of that is about a real demand for those very basic sorts of human rights. And I suppose the fear you were talking about before, is that all of those concerns get trumped by the sort of the 1979 Iran type of scenario. That's often the fear inside Israel. I wonder what you think the changes in Egypt and Tunisia mean for Israel, and whatever's going to happen in Syria means for Israel. And I wonder also what you make of the Israeli government's response to those changes so far.
Those were three questions rolled into one. You know, these journalists are sneaky. But each one of the questions is good, so I'll answer them seriatim. Okay. I think that we are living in an extraordinary period in the Middle East, and it is being transformed before our eyes, and the impetus is democratically driven and motivated popular action. I hasten to add that I don't think that the outcomes are necessarily going to be all democratic. I think they're going to be very varied, and you pinpointed the two countries that have very good chances of establishing democratic regimes. Tunisia more than Egypt, probably. That is amazing. Within a year, the Middle East is going to look different than it has for the past 5 decades. And we cannot underestimate the significance of that move. It's just incredible. So I don't take it lightly. By the way, one of the most interesting things is just since I've been in Australia, I've got messages from the Egyptian initiators a lot of the initial work came on the internet, on Facebook. These are Facebook revolutions in many respects, asking to have contact with Israeli civil society organizations. So there are actually new connections being forged. I find the government reaction quite puzzling, the Israeli government reaction quite puzzling, because for years I couldn't answer the question that was posed by everybody who didn't want to make an agreement. basically saying, how can we negotiate and sign agreements with authoritarian leaders? Democratic societies should make peace with democratic neighbors, let the Arab world democratize, and then we'll make peace. Let me very quickly add that the two lasting peace agreements we have were made with authoritarian leaders. But leaving history aside, when there are democratic uprisings, all of a sudden the Israeli government is in love with authoritarian Arab leaders. Now, really, that was quite beyond me for a while. I don't think it's a wise approach. I think that the changes that is occurring, the democratic elements of the change that are occurring, is a one-time opportunity for Israel. And in many respects should be embraced. I would really embrace it. Because we're going to have to fit into this new Middle East when the dust settles, and it'll settle quickly. And there are opportunities now available that haven't been available since 1948. So here I must say that some people see change and immediately identify all the risks that come with change. And some people see change and they identify all the opportunities that come with change. I, by the way, am probably more of the latter sort. And objectively speaking, every change, every period of massive transition contains both threats and opportunities, and we have to know how to manage and navigate and channel and help mold the change so we take the most advantage possible out of what is taking place. The last thing anybody can afford to do, definitely not Israel, in these circumstances, is be passive.
Sure. These changes are also, it seems to me, are affecting what's happening within Palestinian society. And much as I hate to admit it, Tony Blair's been banging on for years about the fact that if he would be allowed to help get economic growth going in the West Bank, that would change the way the Israelis and the Palestinians deal with each other. And there does seem to be genuine economic growth in the West Bank. It does seem, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Hamas largely seems to not use a lot of the violent tactics that they used to. There is this reconciliation between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank. I wonder if you think that those things also present opportunities. Do you think they are sort of genuine and substantial changes? Because again, there are many people in Israel who say, well, actually, yes, there's genuine changes there, but the reason there's genuine changes there is we kicked them hard in 2009, and that's the reason we're getting genuine change. So I wonder both what you think the causes of those changes within the Palestinian national movement is and what effect it might have in Israel.
I think you highlighted the causes in your question. But since I have to say something, I'll repeat. The first reason is, and it's very much for the last 2 years, since August 2009, the Fayyad Plan, heavily supported by Europe and by the United States and the international community, which specifically stated, we are going to build state institutions in anticipation of independence, and we are going to develop the economy as best as possible. The growth rates in the West Bank now are near 8%. I don't know what Australia's are, but I'm not sure they reached those levels in the last year, or last couple of years, but they're really quite impressive. But much more impressive, and I, by the way, urge every Jew, as well as non-Jew, visiting the region, to go visit Ramallah, just to see what's happening there. They are constructing houses and apartment buildings, and there are stores and shopping malls. The place is flourishing, but it is also very safe. And part of what is going on is that a lot of the quiet on the West Bank is a result of self-policing by Palestinian policemen in coordination with the Israeli military. People stop talking about that, but this is what's going on. So that's one set of answers. By the way, the quiet from Gaza is a tactical decision of the Hamas government on a totally different level. And here I go again. For the past decade, every Israeli government has said, we really can't sign a deal with the Palestinians because the Palestinian Authority doesn't really represent all the Palestinian people. Then when the Palestinians establish a national unity government, and by the way, the candidate is still, last I checked the internet, the same Salam Fayyad. Now we say, no, we can't talk to them because Hamas is a terrorist organization. So it's a little confusing, and if you're confused, you should be. To put in other terms, the second answer to your question is strategically, the Palestinians had to establish a national unity government because they cannot conceive of Palestinian independence except simultaneously in the West Bank and Gaza. For Israel, strategically, if we make a peace agreement, a negotiated agreement, and we are all committed to do so, every single official spokesperson is committed to do so, it is in our strategic interest that it is made with all factions of the Palestinians. So, if you ask me if the Hamas is my cup of tea, hey, I'm a woman. I have problems with people who won't shake my hand because I'm a woman. There is no great enlightenment there. But then again, there's some Israeli politicians that I served with that for the very same reasons never shook my hand and won't shake my hand as well, because I'm a woman. Good Friday was possible in Northern Ireland when people realized that you have to be as inclusive as possible, and when you are, you might succeed.
I will give people a chance to ask some questions too, but there's a horrible trend in Australian interviewing on radio or television. The final question is always, what will it mean for interest rates?
What
will it mean for interest rates? It's just this very boring question that gets tacked onto every interview. But the important question whenever you're talking about this, of course, is that no matter what happens in Israel or amongst the Palestinians, what America does, of course, is crucial. I wonder if you think that the kerfuffle over Obama talking about 1967 borders, just before Benjamin Netanyahu went to talk in America, was there a real, genuine concern about that? Do you think that is really America sort of toughening its line or trying to push Israel genuinely towards a negotiation? Or do you think that President Obama is going to invest a lot of energy in trying to push the two sides together? And do you think that was a sign of it?
First of all, there's nothing surprising about it. Every single draft, every single set of negotiations under Olmert and under Sharon, we haven't had any under Netanyahu. The starting point has always been the 1967 boundaries with adjustment by agreement. I didn't fall off my chair when Obama said it. I understood that there are two camps in Washington. I was in Washington just a couple of days afterwards. Two camps in Washington, and finally Obama enunciated what everybody has been working with, actually for the past 20 years, since Madrid. What I fail to understand is why so much of a fuss was made by Netanyahu, because when you get to the negotiating table, that's going to be your starting point. It's very clear, okay? By the way, Obama said things that Netanyahu should have applauded, and that is the insistence on recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. So there are lots of things in that speech. It wasn't a very bold speech. But your question was different. Your question was, is the United States going to press? And it gives me an opportunity to say maybe two things that are very important. Every single one of us in Israel and the Palestinian leadership repeatedly have an absolute preference for a negotiated solution. Want a negotiated solution. It's the only one that makes sense, that will be durable over a long period of time, and frankly, a negotiated agreement is important also because it will allow for international guarantees. And people always bristle about that, but just remind ourselves that the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty and the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty have all come together with international guarantees and international forces. It's useful sometimes to remember. And I also know with a fair amount of certainty that if negotiations don't begin in the next 3 months, there will be a move in the United Nations to recognize Palestinian statehood, which will make it somewhat more, not somewhat, it will make it more difficult for Israel. It might also jumpstart negotiations. So that, seriously, if you ask me, because of the Arab Spring and because of the shifts in options on the Israeli-Palestinian front, I am increasingly convinced that this is the most momentous period in Israel's history since 1948, because we have to make decisions, and if we don't make decisions, we've made a decision, and therefore a lot of the discussion can't remain at the level of rhetoric. Ironically, we're going to have to act in one way or another. I hope we're prudent enough to make the decisions that will secure our future.
I'm going to ask one more question. Do you think...
You're not allowed to.
A quick one. Do you think Netanyahu's enough of a pragmatist to seize those sort of opportunities, or do you think...
I've been telling in Australia, so it's no secret that Netanyahu and I have never agreed, but he's the Prime Minister. But we do have a very close connection because his older brother Yoni, the hero of Entebbe, was my first boyfriend.
So, wow.
So, in a typical inbred way, they're close connections. I lost a very expensive bet about a year ago because I said I will not live to see the day that Benjamin Netanyahu talks about a Palestinian state alongside Israel. And you know, if he can surprise me once, he can surprise me twice. I think that there is a real realization in Israel today that a Palestinian state alongside Israel is essential for Israel's security and well-being and survival. And therefore, I hope he surprises me again.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'll just allow Naomi to take a breather. But what I would ask you to do is just put your hands up if you'd like to ask a question. I'll point to whoever I'm going to choose, so forgive me if I don't point to you. And do please wait for one of the microphones. Mr. Baker. Familiar face.
One comment, just, I don't know if it's an update, but at least in Haaretz over the last 24 hours, it's been reported pretty strongly that Fayyad's been totally rejected by Hamas. So
yes.
It would be lovely to sort of accept your optimism on that, but who knows. But going back to Obama for a second, my view, I'd like your opinion anyway. Do you think Obama should have been a bit more forceful or gutsy in pointing out in his first speech that in the context of a two-state solution that he'd articulated, the Palestinian right of return, that given what he had done, actually he probably raised the bar unrealistically, that he should have already said the Palestinian right of return would have to be realised almost totally in the context of such a Palestinian state that would evolve, and would that perhaps have given Israelis, particularly those of the centre-left, a bit more comfort as to where Obama was coming from?
I read the same report that the Hamas has rejected Fayyad, and then I landed in Melbourne a few hours ago and haven't been able to connect to the internet, and so I'm having IT problems, which makes me feel very nervous because somebody will immediately say, I've seen a report. But I saw the same report. Hamas has rejected Fayyad, but let's see who's appointed as the Prime Minister. It's not over until it's over.
And on, were you making the point there that Obama should have made more of a point
Yes.
about compensation for right of return, or just made more of a point about the principle?
It's a double question. One is whether you think Obama...
There were two questions.
But my next question really is, Naomi, what do you think about the whole right of return?
That's easier than getting into Obama's mind.
Come on.
Sorry. But you didn't ask that question originally. You just stuck it in now. I noticed that. Look, Obama has had the choice of presenting a peace plan to both sides, which includes the U.S. position on all the outstanding permanent settlement issues, borders, Jerusalem, settlements, security arrangements, and the right of return. He's chosen not to do so. And therefore, asking him to speak out on a specific topic is missing the entire point of his speech. And the entire point of his speech was, let's do borders and security first, and leave the question of the refugees in Jerusalem for later. Whether I agree with it or not, that is the U.S. position. My position on the right of return is unequivocal, and I've stated it umpteen times, so I'll restate it again for what it's worth. And I think that the right of return of Palestinians must be to a Palestinian state, period. I think that one way of dealing, and I want to immediately follow that one way of dealing with the right of return and with the amazing emotional problems of Palestinian refugees and of refugee status is for Israel also to understand, and maybe Palestinians as well, that we share responsibility for the creation of the problem. And here I've taken a chapter from Australia. You know that sometimes saying you're sorry, can allow people to accept something that today they're unwilling to accept, and that is that any return will be to a Palestinian state. Okay? That's one of the things, basic elements of a two-state solution. But it has to come with something else, and that is some sensitivity to refugee status. And who knows better about refugee status than many of us who are children of people who came to Israel precisely for that reason.
There's a hand all the way down the back there.
Naomi, welcome back. My question is...
Thank you.
In your mix that you laid out with the Arab Spring and the possibility of peace, where do you see Iran as the spoiler or out of the question? Or
Iran's the other interest rate question.
Maybe, but Iran is a very important factor.
It's an interesting question, and I'll quote a colleague of mine who, I'm coming from Limud in Sydney, and he was asked the identical question. I'm sorry, I need my sunglasses. He was asked the identical question, and he said, well, he didn't relate to Iran because Iran is not part of the Arab world. It's not an Arab country. But I take your point, so I'll answer it very quickly. These changes are going to affect the standing of Iran in the region, the capacities, the power of Iran, etc. So even in purely geopolitical terms, it's essential for Israel to reconnect in different ways with the countries that are undergoing changes and shifts now, because Iran is potentially a major threat to Israel. And the best buffer are neighbors who retain not only common interests, but common values with Israel. So think of it in those terms as well.
Someone had a hand up down the front.
I really did. I expected to be much more provocative and controversial.
Anyone got a provocative question? Feel free. She wants to be provoked.
I don't want to be provoked.
It's not really provocative, but I just wanted to know, how likely are the settlers to be left where they are?
Yes.
Just saying is that, speaking to some of my Israeli friends, a lot of them would like them to stay there rather than come back to Israel.
I suppose it's no secret that I've been one of the most consistent opponents of the settlement enterprise for the past 40 years. And my feet are killing me from the number of demonstrations failed against settlement construction, because I thought they would be a serious obstacle to reaching any agreement. And unfortunately, I hate to be right, at least in these kind of cases. So will answer your question in two ways. I don't know if you noticed that Netanyahu's speech in Congress was not only an exercise for aging politicians in getting up and sitting down all the time, but also contained an element that many of us had not heard before, and that is the suggestion that some settlements remain within a Palestinian state. So the idea is not so outrageous, but I think your question was tongue-in-cheek. I have talked about this to Palestinian negotiators over the years, and I say, why dismantle? Why evacuate? The best way to keep democracy flourishing is to have a minority in your midst, or several minorities that you have to protect. It keeps you on the straight and narrow. And they looked at me and they said, who are you fooling? You want the economic settlers to go back to Israel, and you want to leave us with the ideologues. If you reverse it, we'll accept.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know where I'd like them to live either. I'd like to, unless there's another question, I might, oh sorry, there's one more.
This isn't a question. I'm a member of Women in Black in Melbourne, and I've stood in New York, and I've stood in Haifa. And I just want to say to you, this is the first time I've heard you speak and have seen you face to face. I want to thank you for the grace and the dignity of your being, and to let you know how much hope you give us who stand on street corners, women far from the seats of power we are seen to be, but we are close to the heart of what it will take for us to survive each other's histories. So I am so moved to hear you. And I just have to say, you had horns on your head, and here in Melbourne there's something called a shit list. And those of us
I wouldn't know what the first word is.
As a proud member on it, it's just to say it's a long way. It's a long trip to come here, I know. But we need you so much. And so I just want to thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Look, I think that's a really nice note to finish on. I'd like to thank Naomi, indeed, for travelling such a long way from Israel to our little part of the world. I'd like to thank you all for coming out on such a cold night. Thank you very much to the Wheeler Centre as well for inviting both of us along, and a reminder that she's here as part of the New Israel Fund, so if that's something that interests you, there's something called Google that will help you find your way. Thank you very much. I hope the night doesn't treat you too roughly.